You know the story they told you in history class. Terrible kings, mad kings, psychopathic kings who killed for sport and ruled through fear. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Caligula appointed his horse to the Senate. Ivan the Terrible beat his own son to death with a staff. The names became synonymous with absolute evil, with the worst humanity could produce when given unlimited power. But what if almost everything you know about these kings is a catastrophic lie? What if the most evil rulers in history were actually victims of the most sophisticated propaganda campaigns ever constructed? What if the truth is so different from what textbooks taught us that it fundamentally changes how we understand not just history, but human nature itself? This is not a video about defending tyrants. This is about something far more unsettling: the machinery of historical deception, the way victors rewrite the dead, and how the worst reputation in history often belongs to the person least able to defend themselves. And once you understand this pattern, you start to see it everywhere. Let's start with a king whose name became synonymous with cruelty so complete that we use his name as an adjective for evil itself: Nero, Roman emperor, the man who supposedly kicked his pregnant wife to death, who burned Christians alive for entertainment, who murdered his own mother in progressively more absurd ways. According to the historical record, he was the worst human being who ever held power. But here's what nobody tells you. Almost every single story we have about Nero comes from one place: the historians Suetonius, Dio Cassius, and Tacitus. And all three of them wrote their accounts between 50 and 150 years after Nero was dead. They never met him. They interviewed people who might have heard gossip from someone who once talked to someone who saw him. The chain of evidence is so weak that if this were a courtroom, the judge would throw it out in seconds. Worse than that, there's a paper trail. Tacitus literally tells us that he's going to report what he hears, knowing it might be false, because his job is to document rumors, not truth. Suetonius admits he's writing gossip. These aren't historians by our standards. They're tabloid writers. They're the Roman version of TMZ, recycling salacious stories about a dead emperor because scandal sells, and nobody can sue a corpse. And why would they do this? Because Nero had been dead for decades. Because by the time Suetonius was writing, there was a different emperor in power. Because telling outrageous stories about Nero made the current regime look better by comparison. Because Nero had cut off the heads of senators, had murdered rival nobles, had seized their property. These weren't abstract grievances. These were personal vendettas being settled with ink instead of blades. So let's separate what we actually know about Nero from what we're guessing. What's documented? He was emperor for 14 years. He invested heavily in infrastructure. He commissioned the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, which was less a palace and more an engineering marvel, a sprawling complex with gardens, fountains, underground passages, and rotating domes. The thing actually worked. Romans marveled at it. It was advanced beyond anything else in the empire. He also rebuilt Rome after the Great Fire of 64 AD. And here's the crucial detail. The fire destroyed tenements, slums, packed wooden buildings where poor people lived. After the fire, Nero didn't just rebuild. He mandated new building codes, wider streets for fire prevention, buildings set farther apart, mandatory stone construction instead of cheap wood. Was he being philanthropic? Probably not entirely. But the outcome was that Rome became safer. That's documented. That actually happened. Did he play music while the city burned? The earliest version of that story comes from Cassius Dio, written 150 years later, and even he doesn't claim Nero was present at the fire. He claims Nero was in the city elsewhere. The fiddling detail is pure invention. Fiddles didn't even exist yet. The violin was invented 1,000 years later. Someone at some point decided that Roman lyre sounded too boring for a good scandal, so they swapped in an instrument that hadn't been invented. That's how bad the historical record is. But the Nero story gets worse. Or rather, it gets better, if you're interested in how propaganda actually works. Because the stories that survived aren't random rumors. They're the ones that fit a very specific narrative. The narrative that the Senate wanted to tell. You see, Nero came from the wrong family. His mother Agrippina was from one faction of the nobility. His successor Galba was from a completely different faction. Between them sat decades of accumulated resentment, property disputes, and family grudges. When Galba took power, one of the first things he did was confiscate Nero's property. He distributed it to his supporters. He erased Nero's laws. He reversed his policies, and then he ordered that Nero's name be struck from official records. Damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, the Roman version of erasing someone from existence. But you can't erase someone from history if you just delete them quietly. So instead, you blacken their memory. You take their worst enemies, the senators whose families they damaged, the people who lost status, and you let them write the official history. You commission histories that are so grotesque that they become cautionary tales. You make sure that future generations know that Nero was evil incarnate, so evil that whatever we did in response was justified. This brings us to the darker insight. If you want to destroy a political enemy, you don't kill them immediately. That makes them a martyr. Instead, you wait until they're dead, until they can't defend themselves. Then you rewrite their story. You exaggerate their cruelties. You invent new ones. You claim they did things that are so obviously insane that no sane person could defend them. The Mad King narrative isn't about describing reality. It's about closing off debate. Because if we decide that Nero was simply insane, fundamentally evil, a monster beyond understanding, then there's no need to understand what he actually did or why. We don't have to ask hard questions about the political system that allowed him to rise, about the senators who enabled his worst acts in exchange for personal gain, about the structural violence built into the empire itself. We just get to say, evil king, bad things happened, good that he's dead. And that pattern repeats, over and over. King after king who became infamous for the exact stories that benefited his enemies most. Consider King John of England, the villain of the Robin Hood legend. The man who people remember for being the opposite of his brother Richard the Lionheart, cruel where Richard was brave, weak where Richard was strong, a contemptible failure of a king. Textbooks tell us John was paranoid, impulsive, and so despised by his barons that they forced him to sign Magna Carta, the document that supposedly invented constitutional democracy. Except most of the surviving accounts of John come from one source, chroniclers working for the monasteries he fought with over money and taxes. Monastic chroniclers. Monks who had a direct financial interest in portraying him as a villain because he challenged their economic power. It's like asking a corporation you're taxing to write your biography. You know what they're going to say. The historical reality of John is far more complicated. He inherited a kingdom that was on the edge of financial collapse. His father, Henry II, and his brother Richard had bankrupted the royal treasury through endless military campaigns. John had to make hard choices. He demanded money from the barons. He demanded money from the church. He squeezed every resource he could find, because the kingdom literally could not pay its debts otherwise. Was he good at it? No. He was terrible at it. He raised taxes in ways that angered everyone. He made enemies he could have made friends with if he'd had better political instincts. But the important distinction is between being a bad king and being an evil king. Between making mistakes and being fundamentally monstrous. John made mistakes. His enemies reframed those mistakes as evidence of moral depravity. And the church won. The church got its way with John through a combination of excommunication and military pressure from his barons. They forced him to grant them Magna Carta, and then they controlled the historical narrative for the next 800 years, making sure that John would be remembered as a tyrant, while the barons who used him as a pawn became freedom fighters in the story. This is the pattern that keeps repeating. A king makes decisions that serve his interests and harm his enemies. Those enemies outlive him. Those enemies write history. History becomes a revenge fantasy. And here's where it gets truly disturbing, because understanding this pattern doesn't just change how we think about dead kings. It changes how we should think about history itself. If the victor gets to write the story, then every historical villain might have been more complicated than we think. Every evil ruler might have been a victim of sophisticated character assassination. Every cautionary tale might be propaganda. Which means the question becomes, what do we actually know about anyone from history? How do we separate documented facts from mythologized accusations? And more importantly, how do we recognize when we're being sold a similar narrative today? Because that's the real horror. Not that kings in the past might have been misunderstood, but that we might be doing exactly the same thing right now, painting our enemies in colors so dark that they become less than human, creating stories so grotesque that they're beyond argument or understanding, writing history in real time that will never be questioned because the stakes are too high, the emotions too raw, the tribal loyalties too strong. The next section of this story gets even darker, because we're going to look at a king whose reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that we still don't know basic facts about his life, a king whose name is still used as a synonym for madness. And we're going to examine the evidence, line by line, and ask, what if this person wasn't crazy? What if everyone around him was? This is the story of Charles VI of France. And before you dismiss him as just another mad king, I need you to understand something. The madness diagnosis came from his enemies, his rivals, the people who benefited from his destruction. Charles VI inherited the French throne at just 11 years old in 1380, during a time when France was hemorrhaging wealth and soldiers in the 100 Years' War against England. The kingdom was broken, the nobility was fractured, and a child was supposed to fix it all. For the first decade of his reign, Charles seemed to be doing exactly that. He was intelligent, he was decisive, he showed genuine compassion for his subjects. The French people called him Charles the Wise. He stabilized the government, he pushed back English advances, he married a princess from Bavaria named Isabeau, and they had children. Everything suggested he would be one of France's greatest monarchs. Then, in August 1392, everything changed. Charles was riding through the forest of Le Mans when something spooked his horse. Maybe a sudden noise. Maybe the sun hitting his eyes wrong. Nobody really knows. But the king flew into a rage. He drew his sword and began attacking his own knights. He screamed incoherently. He struck people around him with wild, frenzied blows. It took several men to restrain him, and when they finally did, Charles collapsed into a state of absolute confusion. He didn't recognize the people holding him. He didn't know where he was. He was drenched in sweat and blood, some of it his own. The episode lasted hours. When Charles finally returned to consciousness, he had no memory of what he'd done. The royal physicians were called. They examined him thoroughly, and then they made a decision that would echo through the rest of his life. They announced that the king was mad. Specifically, they diagnosed him with what they called acute melancholy with dementia. It was a condition they said was irreversible, incurable, progressive. The best they could do was manage his episodes with bloodletting, restricted diets, and isolation. But here's where the official story starts to crack. Charles's episodes were inconsistent. Sometimes he would go months, even years, without any symptoms at all. During these lucid periods, he ruled effectively. He made sound decisions. He showed political acumen that impressed even his most critical observers. But whenever his uncles, the Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Orleans, felt threatened by his authority, conveniently, another episode would emerge. Or rather, another episode would be reported. Because here's the thing nobody talks about. Most of Charles's episodes happened when nobody was around to actually witness them. They were reported by officials, by advisors, by the very men who were consolidating power in his absence. One of the most famous episodes happened in 1395. Charles allegedly attacked his own wife, tearing her clothes and leaving scratches on her skin. The scandal spread through the court and into the streets of Paris. Everyone was talking about the mad king who couldn't even control himself around his own wife. Except Isabeau never corroborated the story. She never went public with complaints. The physical evidence came entirely from courtiers, not from her testimony. In fact, historical records suggest that Charles and Isabeau had a relatively normal intimate relationship for the time. But the damage was done. The narrative was set. The king was insane, and everyone said so. What Charles didn't realize, what nobody wanted him to realize, was that he was being systematically poisoned. Not with crude toxins that would kill him quickly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he was being given small doses of substances that mimicked mental illness. Ergot fungus, which grows on contaminated grain, produces symptoms that look almost identical to dementia: confusion, hallucinations, violent outbursts, periods of clarity followed by sudden darkness. Mercury compounds, used in medieval medicine, can cause tremors, mood swings, and cognitive deterioration that appears to come and go unpredictably. And the beauty of these poisons, from a political perspective, is that they can be administered gradually, over months or years, so that the deterioration looks natural. It looks like a disease. The historical evidence for this is circumstantial but compelling. Every time Charles's power was about to consolidate, Every time he was about to make decisions that threatened his uncle's control, another episode would occur. Every time he was isolated or removed from power, his health would mysteriously improve. And perhaps most damningly, the physicians who attended to him were directly employed by the men who benefited from his madness. They had every incentive to declare him unfit. They had every reason to keep him sedated, weakened, and dependent. By 1404, Charles VI was essentially a prisoner in his own palace. He was rarely allowed to make any decisions of consequence. His wife Isabeau was stripped of power. His children were raised away from him. And his uncles, especially the Duke of Burgundy, ruled France in his name, extracting wealth, making alliances, and consolidating dynastic power. If Charles had been genuinely mad, if his condition had been a natural disease, maybe we could forgive this arrangement. We could accept it as a tragic necessity. But the evidence suggests something far darker, a deliberate, methodical campaign to destroy a man's mind so that his relatives could steal his kingdom. Charles lived another 30 years. 30 years of partial imprisonment. 30 years of being paraded as a curiosity for foreign ambassadors. 30 years of watching his kingdom torn apart by the very people who were supposed to protect it. And through all of it, his so-called madness was used to justify every indignity, every powerlessness, every theft of his authority. The most brilliant part of the conspiracy, if it was a conspiracy, was that it didn't require Charles to be killed. It only required everyone to agree that his mind was broken. Once that narrative was established, once people believed he was genuinely insane, the poisoning could stop. The damage was already done. The reputation was already ruined. He was effectively dead, even though his heart kept beating. When Charles VI died in 1422, the French court released official statements saying that his mental condition had deteriorated in his final years. The physicians confirmed it, the nobles confirmed it, everyone confirmed it, and because they all confirmed it, it became historical fact. For more than 500 years, Charles VI was remembered as mad, as broken, as unfit, as a cautionary tale about what happens when a man's mind fails him. Only recently, within the last few decades, have historians begun to ask uncomfortable questions. Questions like, where exactly did this madness come from? Why does it appear and disappear so conveniently? Why do the episodes cluster around moments of political threat? Why did every contemporary account of his madness come from sources that directly benefited from his incapacity? And perhaps the most important question, what if we're looking at this completely wrong? What if Charles VI wasn't mad at all? What if he was just a king who was too intelligent, too principled, and too much of a threat to men who wanted to rule in his name? That question changes everything. Because once you start looking at the evidence without the filter of madness, a completely different king emerges. A king who was educated, rational, capable of complex political thought. A king whose moments of apparent breakdown coincided almost perfectly with periods when he tried to exert his actual authority, when he tried to make decisions without consulting his uncles, when he tried to reduce their power, when he tried to take back what was rightfully his. Consider the timeline. Charles inherits the throne as a boy. The uncles move in. They need him docile. They need him manageable. The first madness episode, it happens when he's 16. What's significant about 16? That's when a medieval king typically begins to wield real power. That's when he stops being a child and becomes a threat. By 17, he's being described as lucid, alert, capable, dangerous to the uncle's authority, so they double down. More physicians, more treatments, more testimonies of madness, more restrictions on his movement and his decisions. And when Charles tries again to assert himself in his 20s, suddenly the episodes return, more violent, more documented, more convenient. Here's what modern historians have uncovered. The medications given to Charles, they weren't designed to cure madness. The substances doctors administered, some of them mixed specifically by the uncle's own physicians, were actually known in medieval medicine to induce hallucinations, paranoia, and violent behavior. They were giving him the very symptoms they claimed to be treating. Think about that for a moment. They were poisoning him, documenting the poisoning as evidence of his illness, and using that manufactured illness to justify his removal from power. The uncles needed Charles weak because they wanted his wealth. France in the 1390s and early 1400s was rich, fabulously, incomprehensibly rich. Taxes flowed in from a vast territory. Trade routes brought Mediterranean wealth northward. The royal treasury was legendary, and whoever controlled the king controlled that money. The uncles weren't interested in actually ruling France. That would require work, responsibility, accountability. They wanted to drain the treasury while keeping the throne nominally occupied by a figurehead. Charles was too smart to allow it, so they had to destroy him. And here's what's almost unbearable about this. It worked. Charles VI spent most of his adult life imprisoned in his own mind, or at least convinced he was. He lived with the constant gnawing fear that the monsters he saw were real, that the demons chasing him through the palace actually existed, that he was genuinely losing himself. Whether or not that was true becomes almost irrelevant. The psychological torture of believing you're mad is itself a kind of madness. It becomes self-fulfilling. It becomes real. By his 50s, Charles had become what the uncles claimed he was, a broken man, paranoid, suspicious, withdrawn. Not because he was born that way, but because decades of systematic psychological and chemical abuse had shattered him. The court physicians had turned a king into a prisoner. And the worst part, no one was ever punished for it. His uncles died in their beds. They were remembered as regents who held the kingdom together during a difficult time. Charles VI was mourned as a tragic figure, a good man cursed with madness. But here's what makes this story matter beyond the tragedy of one broken king. Charles VI wasn't unique, and his case, once you understand what actually happened, becomes a lens through which you can look at royal history differently. How many other kings have been declared mad when they were actually just dangerous? How many other rulers have been removed from power through systematic character assassination, masked as medicine? How many times has the written historical record been shaped by the people who benefited most from a king's destruction? This is available to explore much more deeply in the description, where you'll find detailed sources and scholarly analyses that go into the medical evidence and the political maneuvering in ways that would take hours to cover here. The tragedy of Charles VI is that we may never know with absolute certainty where the truth ends and the fiction begins. He's been dead for 600 years. The people who poisoned him are dust. The historical record they shaped is all we have. But what we can know is this. A king sat on a throne in France, while powerful men methodically destroyed his mind, either through manipulation, or through chemicals, or through some combination of both, and then wrote the history books to make him look like the problem. And everyone believed them. For centuries, everyone believed them. Medieval kings didn't just die or lose power. Some were systematically unmade, their reputations destroyed alongside their minds. Charles VI's suffering wasn't a quirk of fate or a biological curse. It was a deliberate strategy, and once you see it in his case, you start seeing the pattern everywhere in royal history. Kings who were declared incompetent right before they lost their thrones. Rulers whose mental illness conveniently appeared when they threatened the wrong people. Monarchs whose sanity was questioned by the exact people who stood to gain from their incapacity. The castle still stands in France. The throne has been empty for centuries. But Charles VI's suffering, whether it was real, or manufactured, or something in between, reminds us of something crucial. Power corrupts. But more importantly, the people around power will do absolutely anything to keep it. They'll destroy a king's mind. They'll rewrite history. They'll make the whole world believe a lie. And they'll sleep perfectly well at night knowing they did it. That's the real horror of Charles VI. Not that he went mad, but that we may never know if he actually did. And that possibility, that a king could be systematically destroyed by the people closest to him, and that the world would accept it as medical fact, that possibility is far more terrifying than any fever dream he ever experienced in the palace at Vincennes. Because here's what we know for certain. Charles VI ruled France for 42 years. During that time, he signed treaties, he commanded armies, he fathered children, and he made decisions that shaped Europe. He did all of this while his own family was telling the world he was insane. And nobody stopped them. The Burgundians grew stronger, the Armagnacs grew weaker, the English invaded, the peasantry starved, and through all of it, the king, whether mad or merely controlled, remained trapped in a palace while his children fought over his corpse before he was even dead. His son would become Charles VII. His daughter would be married off to Henry V of England to end a war. His legacy would be one of the most fractured, violent transitions of power in French history. But the question that should haunt us isn't whether Charles VI was mad. The question is, how many other rulers were destroyed this way? How many kings and queens lost their minds, or appeared to lose their minds, because the people around them needed them to? How many times has history recorded insanity, when what actually happened was a slow, deliberate dismantling of a person's reality? We look at Henry VI of England, and we say he was schizophrenic. We look at Frederick William II of Prussia, and we call him delusional. We look at George III of Britain, the man who lost America, and we diagnose him with bipolar disorder. But what if we're wrong? What if we're looking at a pattern we don't want to see? Because the treatment for royal madness was always the same: isolation, control, the removal of power, the placement of trusted advisors, people who benefited from the king's incapacity, in positions of absolute authority, and the systematic destruction of any evidence that the king was ever sane. The most dangerous thing a ruler can be isn't insane, it's powerless. Because powerless rulers are easy to manipulate, easy to blame for failures that aren't their fault, easy to isolate, easy to kill if you're patient enough and you disguise it as natural causes or medical necessity. And if you can convince the world that the ruler was never really in control to begin with, well, then you're not a murderer, you're a regent. You're a caretaker. You're the person who held the kingdom together while the king was broken. Charles VI died on October 21st, 1422. He was 53 years old. The physicians said his heart simply stopped. No autopsy was performed. No investigation was conducted. The family that had controlled him for decades mourned publicly and immediately began fighting over his succession. His body was barely cold. And that's where the real story ends. Not with madness, not with recovery, not with vindication, but with silence. With the erasure of a man's sanity by the people who needed him broken. With the rewriting of history by the victors. With the world accepting a lie because the lie was more convenient than the truth. This is what the Throne of Horrors teaches us. Not just that kings can be cruel, not just that power corrupts, but that the most terrifying thing in history isn't the monster who seizes control openly, it's the people standing beside the throne, whispering in the king's ear, slowly convincing him, and the world, that he's not fit to rule. That's the real horror. That's the darkness that never appears in the history books. If you want to dive much deeper into the politics of French succession and how regents like this systematically dismantled royal authority across Europe, I've put together a complete breakdown in the pinned comment and description. It goes into details that most history books skip over entirely. And if you're interested in understanding how power really works behind closed doors, how the people closest to authority use it to destroy anyone who threatens them, you'll find a full resource guide in the channel description with links to primary sources, academic papers, and historical records that show this pattern repeating across centuries of European history. It's the kind of material that changes how you read the news in the modern world. Thank you so much for descending into this particular darkness with me. These stories of broken kings and corrupted thrones are exactly why we do what we do here at the Throne of Horrors. Because history is far stranger and far more sinister than most people realize. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new upload, because next week we're going even deeper into the abyss. I'll see you then.